Howdy, my good friends. I'm Larry Bentley, and I was born and raised in the Appalachian Mountains by generations of mountain folks who passed down the stories you're fixing to hear. Together, we'll look through the eyes of an Appalachian at the murders, mysteries, legends, and forgotten history that these old mountains, and then every now and again, we'll wander a little beyond them. Welcome to Appalachian Murder, Mystery, and Legend. Hope you're doing well today. Thank you so much for stopping by. Over the past few episodes, we've been walking through the Black Patch country of western Kentucky, where tobacco farmers were squeezed down to nothing, fear started riding horseback through the night, and a whole region slipped into something that, didn't have a clear name or direction anymore. We've talked about the warnings, about violence, we've talked about men disappearing into rumor and into the dark of night, but this time, we're talking about what happens when the daylight finally catches up with the night. So pull you up a set down and lean in while I finish this one up for you. Now, by the time the state of Kentucky stepped in with serious force, the Black Patch region wasn't just unsettled anymore. It was snapped apart like kindling on a campfire. Communities had split into fractions. Some supported the Planters Protective Agency, and some feared the Night Riders. And most folks were stuck somewhere in between that, trying to keep their heads down and their families safe while the world around them went plumb sideways. And law enforcement knew they were behind. Because the truth about a movement like the Night Riders is pretty simple. You can't arrest an idea, you arrest people. And first you got to find them. So investigators started doing what they always do when fear gets too big for a town to handle. They started listening to a whole lot closer, to neighbors, to the rumors, to the people who'd been quiet too long. And slowly, names started to surface. Not always too clearly, not always constantly, but enough to form a pattern that they could get after. Enough to suggest organization, enough to turn whispers into indictment. Now, one of the most important things to understand here is that the Night Riders, they were never a single unified army. They weren't marching under one flag. They were more like an overlapping circle. Men that knew each other, men that trusted each other, and men that sometimes didn't agree on what they were doing anymore. And that made prosecution a little bit complicated. Because when your witnesses are neighbors, your courtroom turns into a battlefield of silence. Still, the state pushed on. Men were pounced on and arrested. Some were dragged in for questioning. Some talked and some didn't. And some stories started to contradict each other in ways that made it clear. Not everybody in the Black Patch saw the same version of what was going on. And then came the trials. Now I want you to imagine this for a minute. A little Kentucky courthouse, packed to the bejesus belt. People standing shoulder to shoulder, men in wool coats to fight the heat, women whispering behind fans, reporters scribbling as fast as their little fingers could work their pencils to move. And in the middle of it all, farmers and neighbors, who only a few years earlier might have shared a drink or worked in the same field, now sitting on opposite sides of the law. Some defendants were charged with conspiracy, some with assault, some with murder, tied to specific raids and deaths that had been slowly piling up on the record. And the prosecution tried to do something real hard. They tried to turn scattered acts of violence into one connected story, a pattern, a movement, or a system. But the defense pushed back pretty hard. They argued confusion, lack of identification, and they argued that fear had turned rumor into accusation. And in many cases, they weren't entirely wrong. Because this story had done got tangled up over years of darkness, and not every thread that could be pulled cleanly apart. But here's the part that matters most. Even when specific cases are hard to prove, The existence of organized night riding was no longer in doubt. The state had seen enough. Communities had seen enough. And the newspapers had certainly seen enough, even though their sales were through the roof because of it. And so convictions began to land, not always the biggest names, and not always the most dramatic crime, but enough to signal something important. The era of unchecked night riding was done. Some men sentenced, some were fined, some served prison time. Some were never fully identified at all. The names just dissolved right back into the same anonymity that they relied on. And slowly, the black patch started to settle down. Not because everything was resolved, but because the pressure finally started to break. Farmers went back to their fields, markets stabilized, the violence receded from nightly fear into remembered history. Here's a part that never fully went away. Even after the trials, after the arrest, even after the headlines faded, people in western Kentucky didn't forget what it felt like. They remembered the sound of hooves at night. They remembered the silence after. And they remembered that for a long while. Nobody was entirely sure who was riding or why. And that's the thing about stories like this. The official history closes the case file. But the communities, well, they keep their own version, passed down in quieter ways, at kitchen tables, on front porches, maybe in conversations that started with, "Have you ever heard about?" Now, before we wrap this series, I want to leave you with something to think about, because the Black Patch wasn't unique in what happened there. It just happened to be one of the clearest examples of something that shows up again and again in rural American history. When pressure gets high enough, when livelihoods are threatened, when systems feel unfair, ordinary people can become part of extraordinary violence. Not because they were born that way, but because circumstances pushed them into it. And that, my good friends, is where the real weight of this story sits. Not in the raids, not in the trials, but in the realization that most of the people involved weren't monsters. They were neighbors trying to survive in a system that had stopped working for them. And somewhere between protecting what was theirs and taking what wasn't, they lost sight of the difference. So as we close this series, night riders fade out of headlines, but most things in Appalachian and River Country history, well, they don't disappear completely. They just become stories people tell when the night gets quiet enough to remember. So till next time, keep your lantern lit, your ears peeled, because if you listen close enough, them old hills are still telling stories. The riders may have stopped riding, but the stories never did. I hope you got something out of our story today. If you did, please rate and review the podcast, or if you're watching on YouTube, Spotify, or Rumble, throw us a like, and don't forget to subscribe or follow wherever you watch or listen. Come on over to Appalachian Murder Mystery or Legend podcast group on Facebook, where we talk Appalachian or about anything else you want to talk about. I'll be back real soon with another Appalachian murder mystery or legend, and I will see you then.